This is not going to be a traditional video. It's going to be a little bit more freeform, a little bit more expressive, a little bit more contemplative, a little more unscripted. Because I'm honestly not quite certain what to say going in, but I knew I had to say something, especially on a day that so many people, in this country at least, are praising as a monumentous occasion. Coming up today, it is the 150th anniversary of the creation of the Dominion of Canada. Yeah, it's a big milestone. It's 150 years that this nation has existed. Not all of it. The base little quantities around Quebec and Ontario and the Maritimes, that existed. Manitoba got added a couple years later. So did Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC. Hell, like when it comes to Newfoundland and Labrador, that got added back in the, I think it was the late 30s, early 40s. And none of it was created as a territory when I was still alive. The point is that Canada has evolved. Canada has changed significantly. And as I've been reflecting on this supposedly monumentous occasion, I've been questioning whether or not it really is all that monumental. And I get the feeling that there are a lot of Canadians that have. And it ties back to the central idea of what a nation actually is. And this is a funny thing because this ties back to nationalism. And it's one of those slightly uncomfortable concepts when you start to think about it. Because what is Canada as a nation? Well, what is a nation itself? It draws to mind the question, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that unites us as a whole. And even then I'm co-opting and bastardizing the language and interpretation from another nation entirely to describe what Canada can be, what the Canadian nation is. And that's telling, because Canada has a very weird relationship and complicated relationship with a lot of its history and with a lot of what we are as a people that are united, especially considering that I live in downtown Toronto and I can't see a lot of the common unifiers. I'll give you an example. Last night, or by the time I post this, it was on Thursday night, I went to an event at the YouTube Space, which is within walking distance of where I live, and there was a funny little thing at that YouTube Space. They basically showed a series of videos identifying what it meant to be considered a Canadian. And, of course, you got hockey, you got poutine, you had maple syrup, you had all of the iconography, really the marketing behind what makes us Canadian. And the funny thing is, the more I was watching these videos that had been produced, the more hollow it felt. The less it felt like it represented any sort of greater national identity. And I'll admit this is something that I've always struggled with because I don't have any definitive connection to any European ancestry. I know people who identify as Polish Canadian or Ukrainian Canadian or African American or Asian Canadian. I don't have that connection in the same way. Because my parents, and grandparents, they came from all different spots in Europe. And it kind of led to a mishmash where any cultural tradition that we as a family had created were unique to the family, not to Canada as a whole. And one thing I also noticed in a lot of these presentations is that Canada has all these superficial branding elements, but at the underlying core of it, at least we're not like the United States, right? And that's the funny thing. The United States has always seemed to have such a very strong core set of identity values. It's been driven off the stars and stripes, apple pie, small towns. Yeah, a lot of the same branding, sure, but it seems so much more ingrained in the cultural psyche than what it is up here, where it almost seems like we're embarrassed to call ourselves Canadian, or to say that, or take any pride in that for us as a nation. And I think that's important to call out because coming up to the celebration of Canada's 150th anniversary, despite very much of a government push in order to reinforce that sense of national identity, I don't think it's worked at all. Like, you have more than ever a series of protests, a series of situations where the First Nations peoples, they've come out and say, yeah, this is what you've tried to define and whitewash of what is the Canadian identity, but you're ignoring the history. And I'll say this, I was lucky growing up in that I had a very firm sense of that history. That was not glossed over in schools. We didn't focus on the great men of history, the great men of Canada who ran the major cultural and government institutions. And if anything, we focused more on the people and who they were at that time. And I think that's important to call out because we didn't have that grand signifier of the great men who defined it. We didn't have a series of founding fathers. When you discovered things about Wilfrid Laurier and John A. Macdonald and Robert Borden and the rest of the early prime ministers, you saw all the ugly details. We didn't whitewash that in the same way. And we learned what happened to the Aboriginal peoples scattered across all of Canada, especially in Manitoba, which is where I went to high school. We learned a significant amount about the residential school situation and the Métis because there was not clean-cut barriers to how much that intersected with Manitoba's history. We couldn't walk it back. But that comes into conflict with the ideal of nationalism, that we as a nation are superior, that we have some hold these truths, and by these truths we are made stronger as a people, and as such we can say that our nation is great in respect to everybody else. At least we're not the United States, but we're always very conscious of that history. And it's why it seems like any sort of celebration of Canada's international prowess that we've reached 150 years feels very tepid to me, or it feels like it has failed to some extent. Because we've been very constantly reminded of that history and we've second-guessed it. And part of this is Canadian culture itself. We always put up a very thin veneer of being kind and being sorry and being humble, when in reality, a lot of it's just based off of comparison of a much more arrogant nation to our south. And I think that's important to call out because at some level, there is some vestige of a nationalist experience of this is who we are versus this is who we are not that we're now being forced to confront in some way, shape, and form. And when certain cultural institutions like the federal government tries to push a line for us, people have bucked against it. At least some people have, at least from my experience. It's very telling that I didn't vote for Justin Trudeau, and he's a very shrewd politician in that regard and playing the image game. But even with this, when he's trying to call back to Canadian institutions and iconography, it's not flying in the same way. It feels muted. And maybe part of that calls back to people remembering the history of Pierre Trudeau and the fact of what he tried to do to unite Canadians, and then what he did in Quebec, and what he did to bring apart the Charter, which still has being holes poked in it as a very incomplete piece of legislation. Because break it down to some level, so much of Canada has been fighting for some vestige of union. The Meech Lake Accord, Charlottetown Accord, a bunch of accords trying to trial together a disparate nature of provinces and two separate languages, and pardon my French, but mon français est libre. At some level, we are still trying to fight for some vestige of union that I don't even think we've ever come to grips with what that actually means in reconciliation with our history. That's another thing. I've lived all over Canada. I was born in Windsor, Ontario. Kind of ironic, it's south of Detroit. Quite the perfect little legacy for a music critic. Then I grew up in Winnipeg. I worked out west. I've seen a lot of the West Coast. I've been through the Rocky Mountains. I then went back to Ontario for university, and now I'm in Toronto. Haven't gone to the Maritimes yet, have no real desire to go to the territories, but at the same time, I've seen the subtle differences and changes within Canadian identity and how we identify ourselves. Because people will call out that we're Torontonians or we're Winnipeggers, more than I think people will identify themselves, at least within Canada as a whole, as Canadian. That's why I've always found it awkward. I try to say I'm a Canadian. I'm trying to forge some sort of nationalism to compensate for the fact that I don't have a nation beyond Canada to call back to. But shouldn't I shouldn't need one, right? If Canada has such a strong national identity, then should I be comfortable identifying as Canadian versus Polish or French or Scottish or Irish or Ukrainian or Russian or anything. And I can't. And yet, there's always been some vestige of nationalism that I've tried to reinforce, even in my content. The Canadian charts are always better. I don't know why I have to say that, beyond the obvious reasons of me thinking that in terms of music quality, but that's... The funny thing is that came out of Canada trying to feed back into its own cultural apparatus, trying to build up Canadian culture to stand on its own, to promote Canadian music, to say that radio stations have to play a certain amount of Canadian content. And there's a kind of sweet irony in that throughout most of the past couple of years, while America has grown more isolationist, who are the artists that are dominating their charts? Drake, Justin Bieber, The Weeknd. Guess where they come from? It's kind of funny in terms of how much Canada is trying to define an artifice and identity that I don't think we fully grasp the consequences of what that defines. Because if we call ourselves Canadian, if we enforce that nationalistic fervor without understanding the deeper context, or without realizing that by defining ourselves as one group, there is another group who are not, I think our own self-awareness about it has made any sort of nationalistic celebration feel a little underweight, not really carrying the same weight. But it has to, right? Like, at least to some extent of this is who we are in terms of any sort of cultural unity, in terms of that our nation stands for something. Except when you look into reality, more of our nation seems like a collection of documents made by wealthy landowners trying to rebel against the encroaching enemies in the South and post-Civil War. And we don't really have much of a defined identity. And the thing is, I think all Canadians know that on some level. The point I'm trying to reach with this, and the point I think that everyone should think about when going into celebrations, especially Canadians going into the celebrations of nationalism tomorrow, or an attempt to market a brand of nationalism, is identify what that nationalism means and what that resonates with. I mean, I can say the Canadian charts are always better, but realize what that represents, and that it's built on a cultural machine in order to reinforce a nationalistic thinking. It's built off the CRTC. When we say we're gonna celebrate hockey and poutine and multiple languages that a full 3/4 of the country doesn't speak, that when we do that, we are necessarily building barriers. And then there's that key little idea of Canada being multicultural, when in reality that we try to put forward a mosaic instead of a melting pot, and yet by doing so we only further highlight those divisions. And yet when it comes to a broad nationalistic celebration, that it very much tries to reinforce that melting pot idea. See all the little contradictions that try to both intensify who we are as Canadians, try to draw us together, and yet further delineate us as different and separate even within our country? Maybe that's it. Maybe that's the key. Maybe that at our core, accepting the contradiction of Canada as a nation versus all the peoples within it. Accepting the differences, accepting the history, accepting all little pieces that make us different, and realizing that maybe that's what it is. Maybe that's what the nationalism is. It's the contradiction. And owning that contradiction. And I don't think that leads to a clean-cut answer. It doesn't lead to a broad, powerful nationalistic celebration, but I think ultimately that's going to fly in the face of what a lot of Canadians think Canada is. But I think on some level we know that. And I think on some level we've already come to grips with it. And I guess Happy Canada Day. Whatever the fuck that means.